All right, and we are recording. And so, Bill, I'm just going to dive right in. Could you introduce yourself for our viewers or mostly listeners who do not know who you are, especially as it pertains to language learning?
All right. Well, thank you, Lois, for that. My name is Bill Van Patten. I'm a former academic. I am no longer teaching or actually doing research right now. Um, I left academia to write fiction full time, so that's what I do now. But for 30 years plus, I was a professor of linguistics, language acquisition, bilingualism, and language teaching, and have written, gosh, should I tell people what I've written, how much I've written? Something like 8 or 9 books, 8 or 9 edited volumes, about 200 chapters and book articles. And I've written textbooks in Spanish and French. I've done teleseries, movies for language learners. I've written materials for language learners, just all kinds of things. I was pretty much it all. I was not just a scholar. I also worked hands on with teachers and language learners as well throughout my career. So that's what I did for a very, very, very long time before I moved back to my home state of California and started writing full time. So that's me in a nutshell.
Great, yeah. And so it seems to me like when you take a look at the language learning world, at least not from, like an academic's perspective, on the internet at least, you have sort of a divide of, you have the people who take like a more, let's say, classical, like normal approach with let's do the textbooks, like let's do the apps and so on. And now we see more and more people doing the input. I think, in part thanks to you and Dr. Stephen Krashen, now some people are actually pretty hardcore into like, hey, this is all about input. Like, this is pretty much the only thing that matters. And so, I guess what I wanted to ask here is that which side? I mean, I have an idea of which side you're on, but what's your perspective on like the biggest misconceptions that people have, like normal people have on language learning?
I think the biggest misconception people have, and I'm going to come back to two things you just said, Lois, about do the input thing. The biggest misconception people have is what language is. People think that language, that there are rules and things that you can learn, like things you learn in your textbooks, right? Like rules about how X works in Spanish or how Y works in French or how Z works in German. And these are found on pages of textbooks. And I think those rules that they learn are what winds up in their heads. That's the biggest and most important misconception that both learners and anybody working with learners have. So you can upload any page. In my old radio show I used to have, Tea with BBP, I used to tell people what's on page 32 of the textbook is not what winds up in your head. And so you can learn all these things all you want, but that's none of that stuff is what underlies actual language use when you're involved in communication, with a caveat. So when you, I think what you said earlier about do the input, it's the only thing that matters. It is the only input, as we understand what it is the only thing that matters when it comes to acquiring language that ultimately underlies communication and language use. That is true. Now, well, let me stop there and see what your reactions to what I just said. If you want me to clarify something, or if you want me to get examples of what I mean. How's that? Let me ask you
Yeah,
how you react to what I just said.
right. So my understanding now is that you're not rejecting the fact that like output or I don't know, like learning grammar and stuff like that, this is not useless, but when it comes to actual uh like eventually communicating in the language, input is really like a necessity. This is the only thing that matters. Is this correct?
Well, yeah, it's input plus the things that already exist in your head, as a learner, as a human being, that allow for language growth. We all
Right.
possess mechanisms in our head that actually recreate language in our head and allows language to evolve. Because language does evolve in our head. Language is not, for example, learning a bunch of rules and you accumulate these over time. Not at all. That's just not how language acquisition happens. And so, what your brain slash mind does is it picks data and pieces of data over time and uses those as part of language growth. And I do mean data. So, for example, you can memorize a chart, but that chart does not mean data for language acquisition. So, if you're learning something like the present tense of a language, you don't learn the present tense of a language. You learn bits and pieces of what is entailed in the present tense because there are underlying abstract features of language that drive how those things are bit by bit by bit acquired over time so that the language system can grow and evolve. Here's a good example from Spanish. So in Spanish, I can tell you, take the verb live, vivir in Spanish, for example. So vivo, I live, vives, you live, vive, he, she lives, vivimos, we live, vivís, you all live in Spain. And then viven, you all live or they live in my dialect, my dialect in the rest of Spanish. Okay, nobody learns that chart. And you don't even learn, you don't even acquire over time that chart. In the earliest stages of language acquisition, every single language learner around the world acquiring language first creates what's called a tenseless system, where you have no tense. Even though your language, your first language, may have tense, that you mark verbs and show this present tense, past tense, and so on. Everybody in the beginning stages has a tenseless language, which is why learners of Spanish in the early stages take the form vive, he, she, lives, because it's the form without tense. It has no person number features and it has no tense marking. And so they use that as what's called a base form, and they tend to use that everywhere to talk about living, right? So yo vive, a beginning learner might say, when it's supposed to be vivo for I live, right? And then over time, the next stage that happens is the system realizes, oh, this language I'm learning has tense as an abstract feature. The system doesn't know yet what has present, past, and future marking, what those markings are. If there's multiple kinds of marking, like present perfect, past perfect, it doesn't know any of those things. It just knows there's this thing called tense. And so then the system starts to incorporate some of the things like vivo and vive, so the next ones to emerge in the system for I live and you live, because the learner is now beginning to mark present tense. The learner may not have past tense or future tense, but by marking vivo and vive, the person that learner is that learner's system is saying there's tense in this language, and I got to put something on the verbs that marks tense. And then later on, the other ones come in, vivimos and vive and vivis and all those kinds. They come in over time. They don't all come in at once. They don't. They come in bits and drabs and pieces over time. And while the learner is working on those things, the learner the system may also recognize, hey, there is such a thing as a past tense in this language. And so it's not just that there's tense, which we call with a capital T tense, as a feature, but small t tense, past, present, future. There's ways to mark things in this language. So while the learner is getting those bits and pieces of things that mark the present tense verb forms, that system is beginning to sketch in something for past tense. And learners of Spanish, what we've noticed is the first thing they do is a stress shift, because in Spanish, present tense, whether it's present tense subjunctive, present tense indicative, whatever present tense forms are on there, like 3 or 4 different kinds of present tense, the stress is on the root of the verb. But once you get outside of the present tense, the stress moves to an ending. So whether it's past or future or conditional or something else, the stress moves. And so when learners are trying to work with past tense, the first thing you get them to do is they put, so bive or bivo become bivi or bive or bivo or something. They put a stress on because the system has started to notice that there's a stress shift that marks tense. So my point in telling you the story is that that system is evolving very slowly by pulling bits and pieces of data from the environment to construct a system over time. And this we've seen over and over and over again with learners, whether in a classroom or not in a classroom. This is just what they do. So that's an example of what I mean by evolve or grow over time. And that's whether you get rules or don't get rules, or whether you study charts or don't study charts. It pretty much is what learners do
So
unconsciously.
then, right, I suppose then the question is, so the system evolves bit by bit, and are you saying that it evolves bit by bit in sort of a not necessarily like a sequential way, like you get a textbook, you learn about the present, you learn about the past. It's not going to evolve exactly like this.
No, no, your
Right.
brain is working multiple things at once as it sees fit. Because language with a set of abstract features has its own timetable in your head. This just as it does with children learning a first language. So second language learners have timetables in their heads that they are unaware of. It's just the way language works, right? Now, I want to go back for a minute and talk a little bit about language again, about rules and charts and so on. Because as I said, one of the biggest misconceptions people have is that they can learn rules and somehow these rules are what's in their head. So let's take a very, very simple example from English, because I'm assuming that your listeners, is this video, is this recording? Is this going to be audio? I don't know if this is going to be, but so if they're seeing us or hearing us or both seeing and hearing
Yeah,
us,
both. Yeah.
I want your listener viewers, let me put it that way, to get a very simple example from English, because I'm assuming most of them speak English. Okay, so you can go online, you can go in a textbook of ESL, you can go to your grade school teacher in the sixth grade in the United States or Great Britain, and you learn that there are such things as subject pronouns and object pronouns, right? So you'll see things like I, you, he, we, and you are subjects, but then me, you, him, her, us, you, and them are objects, right? And you're told that, use subject pronouns with subjects and you use object pronouns with objects or after prepositions and so on. Okay, great. Um, there's two problems with that. First of all, what's the definition of a pronoun? If I ask you that, Louis, because you've studied language, so what's a pronoun? What is if you were to read a definition or a textbook definition of a pronoun, what is a pronoun?
Okay, well, this is going to be super embarrassing. I mean,
Well, you don't have. You can just tell me.
all
No,
right.
Bill. Just tell me, Bill. You tell me, Bill, what it is.
If I give an embarrassing answer, I'm just going to edit it out anyways. But a pronoun is, I mean, it's just like I, you, he, she. Is this what it is?
Well, the definition of a pronoun is it stands in place of a noun. So
Right.
if I mention either you, Lois, or the interviewer, and then in the next sentence, rather than repeat that, I can put in he. So he
Yes.
stands in for your name, or the interviewer, or the man with the headphones on, or whatever, right? So a pronoun stands in for a noun. Okay, that only works for third person. So he, him, she, her, they, and them can refer to the interviewer, the woman on the corner, the boys standing over there, the two dogs. Okay, so, but with I, you, and we, those those aren't pronouns because they don't stand in for anything. So when I say um, I'm glad to be here, Lois. There's nothing before that I stands for. It's not replacing anything. So right away in that chart of these subject nouns and subject pronouns and object pronouns, you see there's two different kinds of things: real pronouns and something else. So your head already has something abstract in it where pronouns can only be third person, pronouns aren't first and second person. So there's no such thing as a first and second person pronoun. They are
Right.
functionally and abstractly and linguistically different from third person. So the fact that they're in a chart together is pretty meaningless because they're not the same thing. So that's one thing. But now look at this. Let's just look at the rule of use subject pronouns for subjects and object pronouns for objects. Great. Okay, so that works great. Really simple sentences like, I'm glad to be here. I use I as a subject of am glad to be here. I can't use me. I can't say, oh, Lewis, me am glad to be here. No, that's not English, right? So you go, okay, the rule works. But then you get into situations like this. Who's there? Suppose I knock on your door. So you say, who's there? I say, I am. But I can't say me am, right?
Right.
But who's there? Me. I can't say I. Who's there? I. No, I can't do
Yeah.
that. But technically, that thing that comes, that me or that I, is a subject of a verb. So why can't I put I in there even though there's no verb? Because presumably there's a verb that's understood to be there. You can't do that. Now you get into compound compound subjects. So I can say, well, Lewis and I are recording right now. I can say Lewis and me are recording right now. I can say he and I are recording right now. I can say him and me are recording right now. I can say me and him are recording right now. I can use just about any one of those things I want as a subject in a compound. So this idea of a subject versus object gets obliterated in a compound subject. Except notice that you can't do the following with a compound. So I can't say me and he are recording. That sounds awful to an English speaker. It's got to be me and him. But why can't I say me and he? Where's my rule about subjects or subjects and objects or objects, right? And then look at objects. In English now, just about anything can be an object. So you can say, Lewis gave the book to me and her. Lewis gave the book to her and I. Yes, you can say that. It's perfectly fine in spoken English these days. You can he gave the book to her and I. So my point being is that this rule you have that what's a subject with the object just goes out the window the minute you look at the way English works and what every second language learner acquires about English as well as first language learner. So there's something much more abstract and complex about these things called I, you, he, she, him, me, they, them, us, we, and so on. There's something much more abstract and complex going on that governs how these things actually work in a language that cannot be captured by textbook rules.
So then I suppose what most people are wondering right now is, okay, so language is more complex than what is outlined in the textbook. So then does that mean that textbooks are not useful? Or is it just the way that they're organized it's just not optimal? What should we do to learn grammar
Okay.
or just learn a
It,
language in general?
it's not that language is much more complex. It's just that languages are abstract. What's in your head, what we call mental representation for language, is complex but also abstract. It defies everyday language to describe what's in your head. And linguists argue about, they've got some things about language they all agree on. There are some things that they're arguing about, the micro parts of how to explain something or how something actually functions. But every person working in language science would agree that whatever you want to call language in your head is both complex and abstract. It's not something to be captured on a textbook page. It just can't. It just cannot. Full stop, period. So what does that mean for using textbooks and so on? I like to talk to people about baby teeth and adult teeth. Okay, you may not remember this, Louis, but you had baby teeth when you were real little, right? We all did. We had baby teeth. And there might even be a photo
Yep.
of you when you're like 2 years old or 3 years old with a tooth missing, right? Right. So what
Oh yeah.
happens
Yep.
is that you have these baby teeth that you have that function early on, but they're not there for the rest of your life. They're not there to perform the function of chewing and making sounds, because we use our teeth to make sounds like dental fricatives and things like that. So they're going to be replaced by adult teeth. So what I tell people is that if you learn these textbook rules, they're like baby teeth. In the beginning stages, they might help you eke out some things and perform some language like behaviors. But what you're really doing is waiting for your adult teeth to come in. And your adult teeth come in because of the interaction your mind has with input in the environment. So those textbook rules that you learn, and that you eke out sentences early on and you're slow and you're halting, that's your baby teeth. And then eventually your adult teeth come in and push the baby teeth out. So that textbook knowledge you have basically falls to the wayside because it's not usable. It's not what language is. So that's the analogy or metaphor I like to give people, that if you're going to use textbooks, and what are they good for, textbook rules, they're good in those early stages when you're heavily, heavily monitoring your speech and you're trying to put sentences together because you don't have language in your head yet. So you use these textbook rules of this tech and learn and and the same is true for vocabulary. So these things that you've learned explicitly, you cobble them together in real time to try to do something with language, but it's not really language yet. It's baby teeth. And as your system builds up over time, the acquired system builds up over the time, the baby teeth fall out and the acquired system takes on more and more. It's almost can be like a switch sometimes. It's literally like you don't even know it happens. Like all of a sudden the acquired system just takes over every language-like behavior. And you're performing almost completely with acquired language, and whatever those rules you had before that you learned explicitly just fall to the wayside.
Yeah, this definitely echoes my own experience with learning, multiple languages. Where in the beginning you may learn with a textbook and a vocabulary list, but especially when it comes to grammar rules, over time, even I learned English. I had to learn like the rules, but now I don't really remember the specifics. It's just much more the case of thanks to the rules, I was able to start noticing things and parsing the language perhaps a little bit. It was perhaps a little bit more easier than if I had to jump straight into a bunch of listening and reading. But right now, I just can't really remember the exact rules. It's just more of a like a raft, I guess. It helps. But I suppose then a lot of listeners are looking for, like what is the approach that they should take. They're like, okay, just tell me what I should do and I'm going to do it. So a lot of people turn to apps because it's very, the whole syllabus is laid out in front of them. So it's pretty easy. But my question here is, I do this with every guest that I have. So let's imagine that from next week, Monday, you have a year, just 1 year to learn a language. And this is your full-time job. You don't have to worry about cleaning the house, about writing books, about, I don't know, anything. This is going to be your full-time job, and you're going to have to learn a language that is, let's say, fairly challenging. I'm not sure. Do you have a language that you would like to learn?
Not at this point, no.
So, okay, let's say, I'm going to say Korean. Okay, so this is pretty challenging, pretty far removed from English. So you have a year, an entire year, and at the end of the year, you really need to reach as high of a level as possible. Otherwise, there are going to be some very bad consequences. I don't know, like divine judgment or anything. But point is, there's like huge stakes.
You have motivation, what you're saying.
Yes. So what is going to be your daily routine like? What sort of program would you follow?
I mean, that's a really good question. I don't know what I would do in that kind of circumstance. I'm guessing that what I would do is figure out some way early on to use something that's going to help me just learn some words so I can bootstrap myself into meaning. And I might learn one or two things like, okay, so Korean is an object final language, so that means it's a head final language. I'm a linguist, so I'm going to call it a head final language. So that's going to tell me certain things about Korean because I'm a linguist. I know that. Head final languages do certain things that head initial languages don't do. Okay, good. So I know that. So that means there's going to be case marking. I know that's going to happen in Korean. And so I'm basically probably what I'm going to do is try to get the best I can, whatever means possible. I don't know any apps. Just learn some words because as soon as I can bootstrap myself into listening and reading, that's what I'm going to do. I want to get myself as quickly as possible to a point where I can interact with the language and process as much meaning-based language as possible. Let me back up and tell you how I learned French because French is my first languages are English and Spanish. So then I learned French as a second language, right? And I can't say my skills in French are very high because I basically gave up at some point because I didn't need to learn any more than I was learning or acquiring. I didn't care anymore, to be honest with you. I didn't have the motivation, as you were talking about. And so what I did was I took a class, like everybody else. I just took a class. I took like 2 years of French, but that wasn't every day. Like you're talking about 8 hours a day for your. I just took classes and learned what I could learn from those classes, and then because of where I was, I sought out French speakers, French conversation groups, and I had an office mate who spoke in French. I did what I could to get as much language exposure as possible that wasn't textbooks or practicing. And then I did things like watch French movies. I went to Paris for a summer. I did everything I possibly could to get as much exposure to French in meaning-based communicative context as possible. And that was before I knew much about language acquisition, by the way. That was an intuition I had. And so I was like, just give me enough to bootstrap me so I can comprehend something. And then I just threw myself at the mercy of French speakers. Like, okay, let's see what I get out of this. And I'm assuming that's what I would do if I were learning Korean. What can I get at the beginning? Where would I get it? To just get some basic things about Korean so that I can then jump into it and forget about textbooks and forget about rules and everything else.
Right, yeah. And definitely there's also the fact that just all the textbooks and the apps and stuff it's just it's so boring. I mean, at some point if you just do that all day every day, you're just going to give up. So then the question is also you do a lot of input, but how important is actually focusing on, output, actually, talking and writing? Does this actually help you improve in the language, or is this just a consequence of getting a lot of reading and listening?
It's largely a consequence. And so I always tell people that if you look at what language learners do at different stages of development, whether they're, I won't say beginners because beginners have a very hard time, but intermediate speakers, advanced speakers, and then more advanced speakers. Making output and speaking, forget about writing, because writing is a separate weird thing that involves processes that are slightly different. Not slightly, but different from speaking. Because in speaking, you're in real time, there's time pressure. You can't go back and correct. You can't edit what you're doing. You are like you and I right now. I write fiction for a living now, right? So when I write in English, for example, I'm constantly monitoring what I'm saying. I'll type a sentence. Like, wait. That's not what she was. I go back and go, no, let's do this. And I'm just constantly monitoring what I'm putting down on paper. That is very hard to do in one-on-one real-time speaking. So what I tell speaking doesn't make you learn language. It can't, because it doesn't. The data for learning language are in the input you're exposed to. Your brain is hardwired to incorporate language from the environment. End of story. But what speaking does do is get people to talk to you and get people to interact with you so you get more language, you get more input. So here's an anecdote. um, about myself when I was teaching in Quebec one summer, Quebec, Canada, or Quebec, as we like to say in the United States. And I had been invited to teach there in the summer at Laval University in Quebec City. And my French was probably like intermediate high at that point. I didn't have to teach in French, which was a good thing because I probably wouldn't have been able to do it. Um, but I was invited to lots of people's houses and dinner parties and so on. And I went to one dinner party, and there were people speaking really fast French, and they're from a different part of Canada. And man, I was lost. I'm like, oh my God, this is not working. And I tried to jump in the conversation, but mostly I just sat there. As opposed to another dinner party I went to where the people spoke slower, they were more deliberate in how they said things and thought things, and they really attempted to include me in the conversation. And so I felt more comfortable speaking, even though my French was not good, right? It was far from perfect. But the more I interacted with them, the more they talked to me. And the more they talked to me, the more I heard French. And I remember that particular dinner party, I walked away going, these are the people I need to interact with. These are my people, right? And not because I could practice my French, but because I could get them to talk to me. And so I tell people that speaking a second language, when you're not advanced, even when you're advanced technically, it's not a way to practice language or get language. It's a way to get more language from other people and other sources. So your system can keep building and growing.
Yeah, it's also I think about I actually thought about this recently where I'm constantly trying to get sources of input like movies and podcasts and stuff like that. And I guess the struggle is really finding interesting stuff. I think in English, for English learners, I mean, English learners are so blessed because there is a massive amount of stuff on the internet available for free. But if you're learning other languages, even Japanese, it's like, how do I find good stuff? It's harder. And so actually talking with people, they're going to talk to you, and this is to me like the best, like the most interesting content, because we were having a conversation and we're talking about our stuff. So and then you get to make friends with people from other cultures, so this is really great. One of my concerns with talking with people is, yes, you get a lot of input and it's a lot of fun, but a lot of people are concerned about if you start speaking early, or not necessarily early, but at a point where you tend to, maybe you didn't have enough input or you're still making mistakes, is there a possibility that these mistakes are going to become, patterns in your mind that are then going to become very hard to, remove from your speech? Is this a valid concern?
Well, first of all, I always tell people, look at first language learners. Is that what happens to a 2-year-old? Does a 2-year-old freeze at speaking like a 2 or 3-year-old? No. By the time they're 4, they're speaking differently. By the time they're speaking differently. By the time they're 8, they're speaking differently, and so on through the rest of their lives. So theoretically, no. It's not that speaking imperfectly somehow does something to you and you can't keep acquiring. That's not the case. Now, with that said, that's theoretically. With that said, second language acquisition is slightly different. Even though it uses the same processes as first language acquisition, even though at the core, first and second language acquisition are fundamentally the same thing, there is something about second language acquisition that causes people to be non-native like. And it's not because they spoke early or somehow they fossilize. I hate that term. They fossilize, or patterns stuck in their head, and there's no such thing as patterns anyway. That's not what's going on. It's one of two things, or a combination of both. One is what second language learners undergo that first language learners don't undergo, is a societal thing, which is that's good enough. First language learners don't settle for that's good enough because they really want to be part of a speech community. They are part, language becomes their identity. That's not true for second language learners for the most part. So they don't have the same stake in learning a second language that first language learners do. And that's external to the language processing, language learning mechanisms themselves.
Yeah.
So second
Yeah.
language learners
Interesting.
either
Yeah.
abandon, they stop, they slow down, they don't care anymore. Like my French is not improving, I can tell you, probably to are you a native French speaker, Louis?
Yeah. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not. And so you probably hear me speak French. You go, oh my God, he speaks pretty lousy French. But I'm going to tell you, it's good enough for me. I don't care. I don't want to learn any more French. I'm perfectly fine with what I have.
Sure. Yeah.
And so second language learners do that for whatever reasons that are not linguistically related or psycholinguistically related. They're effectively related, or again, they're outside the language making mechanism that cause. The other thing is that we know from second language research is that there can be some leakage, even though you need access to input, even though you interact with input, even though at their core, first and second language acquisition are fundamentally the same. Second language learners may have a first language system that leaks somehow. I like the word leaks because we don't quite know how it works. Um, Leaks into the learning of the second language so that you might wind up with an accent. You might wind up with some structural things that just are not going to sound native like. Well, we don't know why it happens. It just does. We have no idea. And it doesn't happen to everybody. You could have 100 people with the same first language learning English, for example, and they'll be on a wide scale of differences in how far they get and how native like they are. Some sounding so native like you speaking English. I think you said that's a second language to you. Sound like they're native like. Then you got other people with your background learning English and they don't sound like you at all. They sound like someone with an accent in a movie, like a character in a movie. And so, and we don't know, we don't know what causes those differences. We have no idea. But we know they're not due to something like you spoke too soon or you learned bad habits. So no, that's not what happened at all. We know that. That's not what's going on.
Yeah. That's actually reassuring because I'm trying to get back into learning Italian, which is quite easy for a French speaker. I mean, easy, compared to like other people. But I was thinking of getting like a tutor on the internet to just speak. But then I'm always debating in my mind, am I going to form these bad patterns and stuff? But apparently, this is not too much of a concern. But then,
No, no.
yeah, this is very reassuring. But then you talked about, people, there's a wide range of sort of, people end up, even with the same program, with the same focus, probably with the same motivation, they end up speaking at probably a different level of accuracy. And I suppose what a lot of my viewers and, listeners are concerned with is accent. Like, I'm not even talking about like pronunciation. Some people talk with very good pronunciation. It's very easy to understand them, but still, they have a very strong accent. I feel like this is. I don't think this is a problem. It adds a little bit of fun. When someone speaks with an accent, it's always like, "Oh, where do you come from?" and stuff like that. But a lot of people want to sound, native-like, and I've talked about people who sound very native in different languages, in French and English and Japanese. Uh, is there any way that people can develop, or is it even realistic to aim to sound like a native person? And if so, what should people do to do this?
I mean, you can aim at anything you want. I think that's a fool's errand in language learning, language acquisition, because you may not have any control over that. Individual differences are built in to second language learning, and so you might set yourself up for expectations you can't meet. So I just don't even talk about that stuff to people, and if they bring it up, I just go, nah, that's anything I'm concerned about. And I don't think there's anything you can do to make yourself sound native like. Again, we don't know why some people do and some people don't sound native like. We don't know why some people get this far and some people don't get that far. We just don't really know why. So there's nothing that somebody like me can tell an aspiring language learner what to do because we don't even know why it happens. It just does. So there's no scientific basis, no research evidence, no research basis by which we can say, well, try this because we think this is what's going on in the human mind. Just no. It just, there's nothing we can tell you. And just remember that individual differences are built into the fabric of life for everything we do, not just language learning, for everything. And people, again, if you try to compare yourself to other people and what they're doing with language, you're going to be sorry. Just concentrate on what you're doing. And if you want to sound like native-like, if that's your goal, you might very well get to be native-like because that's just something inside you is doing that. But I've never actually run across language learners in my lifetime that have even said that. So I've never had that conversation with Lois. I don't know what I would tell them. Now I think about it, because I've just never had that conversation.
So when
Yeah.
you say native-like, are we talking about specifically pronunciation and accent, or does this also include just correct use, accurate use of the language?
Well, don't forget language is multi-componential. I talked earlier about how complex it is. So language consists of things like phonology, the sound system, phonetics, how those sounds are reproduced in real time. Then comprehension of those sounds. So it's not just speaking, but it's also comprehending sounds. Can you distinguish sounds like a native speaker can? Um, and then there's syntax, which are the properties that govern the nature of sentences. There's morphology, the shapes of words, whether they have prefixes, endings, how you turn a noun into a verb into a noun, all that kind of stuff. Then there's semantics, which is the link between structural components of the language and words and abstract meaning. Not semantics like the way it's used every day, but abstract meaning. And then there's pragmatics, which is speaker intent. So when a speaker makes an utterance, is it a statement, or is a person really asking a question, or is a person making a compliment, or what is the speaker really trying to do when making that utterance? And then there are prosodic contours, which is the stress and rhythm patterns, pitch, contour, all that kind of. So language is incredibly complex. A sentence of like 5 words has so many components interacting. It boggles the mind how we even acquire language. It just boggles the mind because all those things have to work at the same time, not just one and not just another, but all of them at the same time when we speak or when we listen or when we read and so on. So when I say native-like, you can be native-like across the board. You can be native-like in some domains, native-like in one domain. Native-like it depends on what aspect of language you want to look at.
Right. And still on the topic of not necessarily like native likeness, but specifically accent. Sometimes I think, specifically in the case of like in my case, for example, as a French speaker, uh, I think I feel like speaking with a French accent seems, at least to my understanding, for Americans or for English speakers, like, oh wow, you're from France, or you sound like I don't know, you're like a French speaker. Whereas when they listen to me, they're like, I don't know, it's kind of weird. Not a French speaker, at least. So yeah, I suppose there's no point in trying to sound too native. There's always a little touch of it's interesting when you have an accent. Now onto a different topic. I wanted to talk about teaching because I talked to Paul Nation yesterday, and I asked him like, what is the biggest misconception of people like in the language learning world? And his answer was the role of teachers. So essentially, his answer, well, he talked about a lot of things, but the role of a teacher is right now there's a lot of teaching going on, which apparently he did not really agree with. So, what is your opinion on, ideally, in the best world possible, what should a teacher do?
Well, I don't know what Paul actually said to you. I've read some of Paul's work, of course. I know who he is. And we probably would dovetail on some of the comments I'm about to make, but I'll let him listen to this and watch this video and make his own determination. But um, I always, when I talk to teachers, say teachers and teaching is just a word we've got to get rid of. If you're interested in language acquisition, um, there are two ways to approach a language classroom: language as subject matter and language as something to be acquired. Now, most schools of education, at least in the United States, and my guess around the world, when quote unquote teachers are formed, um, they don't know much about language acquisition. They don't know much about language. They don't know much about education, communication. They just don't get any background in that. Instead, they get backgrounds on what it means to be a formal educator. So let's just say you're going to get a Bachelor of Arts or Bachelor of Science in Teaching in the United States with an emphasis on Spanish or French or German or Russian. You'll probably never take a course in linguistics. You'll never take a course in language acquisition. You'll never take a course in the nature of communication. You just don't. And if you're in a school of education, you might take a course on the teaching of languages. And I can guarantee you in that course, if you spend a week on the nature of language or a week on acquisition, you'll be lucky. Most places don't even do that. And so behind that approach is that you approach the language classroom like you would approach science, math, history, geography, name another science, some kind of science, chemistry. Right? You have textbooks. You have a teacher who teaches at students. Students learn, and then they demonstrate their knowledge on a test or something. And that's basically that's the main model for language classes around the world. And that's because language teachers see themselves as teachers. Now, I try to tell people that if you're interested in developing proficiency in your learners, or your goal is communication, or you want to foster language acquisition, you have to get out of that mindset of being called a teacher, because you can't really teach language. You can only help it grow in the minds of learners. So imagine you're a farmer and you're trying to grow corn. You can't make the corn do what the corn is not going to do, right? The corn is genetically predisposed to do certain things. What the farmer does is make sure it gets water, make sure there's sunshine, make sure the dirt has nutrients in it. The farmer is basically facilitating the growth of the corn. But you put that little seed in the ground, you have no control over what that seed is going to do, because everything that seed needs to do, everything for that seed to become a corn stalk and produce more corn is already in that seed. And that's what language acquisition is like. And so teachers are almost like farmers. I can't make a person learn language. I can't teach language at them. I'm more like a farmer helping it grow in their heads. And so I've talked with teachers about this. I go, what would you like to call yourselves if you were focused on communication in the classroom and language acquisition and so on? And they bandy about words like, oh, I'm a language facilitator. Okay, well, that sounds good. Or I help acquisition. That sounds good. They come up with all kinds of ways to reconceptualize themselves. And so I just think that we need, in language, if our goal again is proficiency in development of communication, need to get away that idea of teaching. And that, yeah, we might call the people in our classroom students, but I prefer to call them learners.
Right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Totally. I definitely feel like teachers should, especially like with all the teaching going on, it leaves very little time unless you're doing it on your own for, doing extensive reading and a lot of listening and stuff like that. Now, I want to talk specifically about reading because I feel like a lot of people are they underestimate how powerful reading is. Also, there's also a part of me that thinks that people, younger people, not even like super young, like people my age, 30s or so, they just don't really read at all. Like hardcover books and stuff, even in their native language, so they don't develop this taste for just reading, for pleasure. And this is a huge loss. Do you think that one can actually do, let's say, just listening? You just do listening and you just ignore reading because you don't like it. Is this still okay, or do you need to do the reading?
Um, it depends on how far in language you want to get. Let me just back up and say I appreciate your comments about readers and people not reading as much. As a writer now, as somebody who writes fiction, I wish more people would buy my books and read them. But that's my lament, because I agree with you. I don't think people read enough. I have academic friends all over the country who are on my Facebook page and so on, and maybe they're busy with their research and so on. I can't even get them to buy my novel. You know me. I'm Bill Van Patten. You know me. Buy my damn book and read it. But they don't, because they're not reading fiction. They're doing something else. Um, so I appreciate your saying that. But let's look at a first language. I'm going to give you a simple example. Passives and actives. Okay, so an active sentence in English would be, the cow kicked the horse. You got that in your mind what happened, right? Now, if I say the horse was kicked by the cow, that's the exact same scene. There was a cow that did some kicking and there was a horse that got kicked, right? So whether the cow kicked the horse or the horse kicked the cow, it's the same scene. One is an active sentence, the cow kicked the horse, and the other was a passive sentence, the horse was kicked by the cow. Okay. Children learning English as a first language are pretty crappy with passives up until the age of like 7 or 8. Half the time when they hear passives, they get it wrong. Like little kids at the age of preschool kids, for example, if you give them puppets to act out, like, show me that the horse was kicked by the cow. They think the horse did the kicking, and they show the horse kicking the cow. So they're processing passives wrong. They don't have. And then they get them sometime by the time they're in grade school. You start to see a real differentiation between actives and passives, that they know the difference. What we've seen with adults in English, in some research, so let me qualify that, is that you can take college educated and non-college educated adults and test them on passives. And you test two things. When they hear a passive, do they make mistakes in interpreting passives? And the second thing is how quickly they process passive sentences as opposed to active sentences. And what the research is pretty suggestive of is that college-educated adults in English process passives faster than non-college educated adults, and they make fewer mistakes in interpreting passives. Because you can still make mistakes. You hear the horse was kicked by the cow. And if you're reading quick, there's just, particularly if the sentence is a little bit longer, whatever, you might misinterpret the passive. That can happen to anybody, right? Okay, so these college-educated people make fewer mistakes and process passives faster than the non-college educated people. So, Louis, what do you think is the difference between the college-educated and non-college educated?
Well, a huge amount of debt first, and then second is it depends on the country though. I mean, in France it's just a different system. But yeah, a lot of reading, I suppose. College educated
You,
people had to read a
yep.
lot.
College-educated people read. That's what they do par excellence. They read constantly. They read in their English class. They read in their history class. They read in their business classes. They read in their science classes. They read in their philosophy classes. You just cannot go to college and not read. And some of them are in college because they're readers to begin with too. So they also read fiction. They're read all the novels in high school they had to read, and they read all the short stories the teachers made to read, and so on. And a lot of non-college educated people just either don't read or don't read as much. So so it's not that they have a formal education, the college educated people, they just have been forced and or want to read more and lots of it. So what that suggests to us is that in a first language, reading is fundamental to developing the broadest ability with communication and language as possible. And Paul probably talked about this too yesterday. Reading increases your vocabulary like nobody's business compared to just oral language. You can have one or two words to mean something, but if you read a lot, you'll find out there are 5 other words that can mean the same thing, but you would never hear them because they tend to be more in print than in spoken language. So you develop more vocabulary, and you develop ability to like process more complex sentences. And beyond the basics of structural elements of language, you understand things like style and discourse, how sentences fit together, what a formal tone is as opposed to an informal tone. I mean, just there's all kinds of things that happen to you through reading that you don't get if you're just exposed to spoken language. It's just, to me, it's so clear. So if that's true for first language, why wouldn't it be true for second language? In fact, it has to be true for second language. Has to be true. So the more you read in a second language, the more language you're going to learn, and the more ability with language, the second language you're going to get in the long run. That doesn't mean necessarily that you read from the get that, you have to read from the first day. Let's say you want to learn Russian. So I'm going to start reading Russian the first day. That doesn't mean that. It just means in the course of your time frame in learning Russian, the more you read, the more you're going to learn Russian. The more you read, you're going to more German, the more German you're going to learn, and so on. That's what it means.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like the in terms of vocabulary, it definitely makes a big difference among other things. But in terms of I just thought about this, but is there a difference between reading fiction and reading nonfiction? Because I read a lot of nonfiction, but I never really got into fiction. I suppose it's not that I don't like it, but uh I don't know. I just never got into it. Am I missing out here?
Necessarily, no. I mean, there's no, I don't think so. I don't think so. I think you are. As a writer, I think you are because you're missing some great stories. And reading for pleasure is it's like watching movies. It's like to me, fiction is just so much fun. And the way what writers do with language, right? That you don't get in nonfiction. So in nonfiction, 9 out of 10, you're going to read something like The Sun Rose. In fiction, you're not going to read The Sun Rose. You're going to read something different that evokes the feeling of a sun rising. So to me, when you don't read fiction, you're missing how people use language to display things and do imagery that you just don't get in nonfiction. But that doesn't necessarily impact your ability with language. Again, that goes to style and tone and things I was talking about earlier. But it's not going to impact your syntax or morphology or spelling or anything like that, that you don't read fiction. You just miss out on some fun stuff.
Yeah, no, it's true. Because I remember Dr. Stephen Krashen always talking about, you need comprehensible input and it needs to be interesting. And so if you only read nonfiction, I tend to read obviously around, my interests. And it's like there are only so many books that you can read about Alzheimer's disease, right? It's always going to be the same thing. And at some point, it's not going to be interesting anymore. Whereas fiction, there's no, limits. So maybe there is an argument to be made for the fact that, there's more interesting content in fiction, I suppose. Yeah, so talking about your writing, so you're writing a lot of fiction nowadays. Can you talk a little bit more about this? Because I think it's a little bit unusual. You worked in academia, and now you're an author. So tell us about this.
Yeah, it was. I've always liked storytelling, and when I was an academic, I worked on a telenovela in Spanish, writing scripts and so on, which is 52 episodes of that series, and then I did a movie in Spanish and a movie and a sequel in French. And excuse me, that creative side, it's always been there, but I never really did much with it. And that was at Michigan State, my last position I was at, where I thought I just want to get into fiction writing. So I actually joined a local critique group and started working on some short stories. And then what happened was it was 2017, I believe, 16 going on 17. I'm from California. I came to California to visit my sister. And she's older than I am. And she was looking older. And I thought, oh my God, she's getting older. That means I'm getting older. How many years I'm going to have left with my family and my sister? And I don't want to be, miles apart from her. So I just basically packed up and moved. I just left my job at Michigan State, moved to California, started writing full time. I said, I'm going to write full time. And I still had one foot in the door that with second language stuff. Again, I still do that, but it's the minority of my time. The majority of my time is spent fiction writing. And the the first thing I did was a book of short stories, and then I wrote a novel called Poseidon's Tale. Poseidon is short for Poseidon, the king of the sea, the ruler of the seas, the god of the seas, Greek mythology. And I guess I did pretty well with that. I won a semi-major award for that book. And oh, cool. And I just kept writing, and so since 2017, I've published 5 novels, 3 books of short stories. I'm working on my 6th novel right now. It's in the final stages, editing and polishing and blah, blah, blah. I'm working on a novela, that's Spanish. How do we say it in English? Novella. I don't know how we say it in English. A novella in English is a short novel, like 30,
Yeah.
40,000 words, as opposed to a full-length novel, which is 70 to 80,000 words. So we're going to novella now, in another book of short stories. And so that's just what I do. And I write, um, Poseidon's Tale is the first novel I did was 2 stories in one. It's a story of a guy who's fleeing Lubbock, Texas, where I taught for a while. And he's on the back roads of Texas, and he's fleeing the highway patrol. So he's on the back roads so that he won't get caught on the highways. And he almost runs over this old man on the side of the road. And so he offers to give the old man a ride to the next town and so on. And the old man claims to be Poseidon, ruler of all the seas. And so they start this trip together, and this old man starts to tell his life story as though he were Poseidon. So the chapters go back and forth between the present, which is about Jake and him fleeing Lubbock and trying to get away from this highway patrol man. And the other chapters are this man telling him his life story as Poseidon. And so my latest novella, the one I'm working on right now, has gone back to Greek mythology. I'm writing a novella about Ganymede, the young boy who was abducted to Olympus by Zeus. But in between those, most of my fiction is just adult contemporary fiction where I focus on family drama, secrets that people have, and how families unravel because of secrets. And it's kind of like Tennessee Williams, Eugene O'Neill, what happens behind the closed doors kind of stuff.
Right.
So that's what I do.
Yeah, this is really interesting. I've always been interested uh in how, whether it be fiction or nonfiction, how writers actually, the way they work. It seems like, so you said that you're about to publish your 6th book, right?
My 6th novel, yeah.
6th novel, and so from an outsider's perspective, it seems like, wow, you've been at it for years, and it's only like 6 books. But then it seems like authors have a, like, it takes a lot of time to write a book, a high quality thing. And so I'm curious, as far as like, what is the process like? Is it like the writing that takes a long time, or I suppose the publisher also has to review the book, and there's the whole review process. What is the process like?
Yeah, I mean, you draft, and if you're someone like me, you're part of critique groups, people who are other writers who read your work. You share your work and they critique it and give you feedback. Oh, I think you missed a plot point here, Bill, or or oh, this scene doesn't seem very well motivated. And you go back, you go, oh yeah, you're right. You ditch it, you get rid of it, or you rewrite it or something. So there's getting something. Let's just say a novel. Forget about short stories, but a novel is about 25 to 30% writing, drafting, and about 70 to 75% rewriting, revising, and self-editing. And then if you add in actual editor's work, once you get a manuscript, if you go through traditional publishing where you self-publish, you need a developmental editor who's going to look at it with eye toward what is the average reader, how's this going to work, and how's your plot structure. They give you more feedback on that kind of stuff, and then you do revisions as needed. And then, so that adds to that whole process of revision and rewriting. Then you have copy editors, just like you do if you're writing an article, journal, like a nonfiction thing or a scientific paper. You have copy editors who go through line by line and, oh, you missed a comma here, or, oh, you did this, or that's not the word you want to use there, that kind of thing. And so it takes all those steps just to get a manuscript ready for production. And then after that is when it goes to the designers and the people who design your cover and interior and all that kind of stuff. And I like all of that. The copy editing process to me is that's just mechanical, but I like all the process of writing, from drafting to critiquing and working with other writers to getting feedback from developmental editors and the whole entire process to me is just, I love it. I just It's great.
Yeah, this is
Um,
fascinating. Sounds so much different from like your, normal office job. I mean, I'm a software developer. It sounds so exotic in a sense. I do have a few more questions about
yeah,
language learning.
sure.
So first, I wanted to talk about sort of a, I guess, taboo subject. I suppose it's age and language learning, because I do have some people, asking me questions about, well, I'm 60 or I'm 70, or can I learn a language, or even worse, I'm 40 and I doubt that I can learn a second language. What's your opinion on this? Is it possible? And if so, to what up to what level is it possible to get really good when you're, let's not say 40, but 60, 70, 80?
Yeah. I mean, language acquisition, like anything, is time on task, um, coupled with motivation. Again, remember what I said earlier about good enough? Like my French learning is over. I mean, I'm not going to acquire much more French because I just don't care to. Um, and I don't spend any time in French anymore. So, so I'm in my good enough stage, right? So all language learning, regardless of age, is partly dictated by time on task, how much time you have for it, and then how much motivation, how far you really want to get. And by time on task, I don't mean, sitting there with flashcards. I mean time on task in the sense of exposure. How much time do you have to be exposed and interact with the language, with other speakers, and so on. So the later you start, the less chance you have of being further along than somebody who started sooner than you, because that's just less time you have exposure to the language, period. And too many people think about language learning, language acquisition as some kind of part-time thing, but only for super learners, and we don't really quite know what drives those people. Maybe you're one of those, Lewis. I don't know. Pete Buttigieg looks like he's one of those. People just are really good and quick at acquiring languages, and they're few and in between, but they exist. The vast majority of people just need lots of time on task. But the problem is people tend to think of things in years. Like, how many years is it going to take me? It's not so much years, but it's hours. If you look at first language acquisition, I always tell people, because people think first language acquisition, oh, kids, they learn language so easily, but actually they don't. Kids spend a lot of time learning language, and they go through lots of things where they're not native like for a long time. So if you look at the number of hours a child spends learning a first language, by the time they get to school at the age of 5, 5.5, they've already spent like 14, 15,000 hours just learning language. That's all they do because they're not, they interact and that's their job. Their job is to grow up and learn language. And then they start school and they're still learning language. We did earlier I told you about the passives and so on and so forth. Lots of things in language, it just keeps developing. And so by the time you get the passives down, you've got another how many, now you're at 20, 24,000, 25,000 hours of language learning going on. The adult who's 40 years old, how long would it take them? I mean, what could they do to get 20,000 hours of really quality language learning going on? It's so people tend to think in years. Oh, if I do this a little bit each day, then in 4 years I'll be fluent. And it doesn't quite work that way for the average person. It just doesn't. And then you get lied to by certain commercial language learning companies that say, oh, in 10 minutes a day, you can have a real conversation in Spanish. And I'm like, well, no, actually you can't. You can, in 30 days, you can learn a few phrases and learn how to say, where's this and where's that? And when you go to Spain, but you can't really have a conversation with anybody because you really don't have language in your head yet. So people get lied to about that kind of stuff. So whether you start at 30, whether you start at 40, or you start 60, anybody can acquire language. Anybody can. It's just time on task, motivation, exposure, and making sure you do the things that really are going to help you get language, as opposed to spending time doing things that are just, in the long run, not going to get you much language.
Yeah, this is great. Uh, Bill, is there anything that we did not talk about that you want to mention?
Hey, no, you're driving this boat, as they say. So you have the questions. I don't have anything else I can think of that I want to talk about. We talked about language, communication, what people do, age, individual differences. We talked about so many things. I don't think I have anything else to add. You don't have any last minute questions for me, Lewis?
Yeah, no, I'm not sure. I'll let the viewers and the listeners decide. On YouTube, they're going to leave comments, and I'm going to be answering these. Of course, I'll put a link to your website in the description of the video, and wherever people are listening to this. But this was
Great.
really great. I think people got a lot from this. So thank you so much, Bill.
I hope. Well, thank you. This has been fun.